So here you can see my setup to do the single object painting, which is the first painting that you'll do. I have taped some canvas paper here onto my board, creating a 6 by 8 inch rectangle, which is the size that you need to do each of those in. I've set up my easel close to my subject matter, and I've brought my subject matter up to a height that my subject matter and my area that I'm painting are at a similar height, so that when I stand back and make all my painting decisions from a position further away, is that I'm comparing the two of them, seeing what's different between my painting and what's going on in the subject matter, and then adjusting and making those changes where I need to. As I said earlier, or I may have said to you last term, is that please stick with some simple subject matter. Don't try and make it really, really complicated for yourself. The simpler you make it, the more likelihood that you are going to complete the exercise in the half-hour time frame. So that's where I do say, and I recommend, pieces of fruit, boring things, pears, jugs, etc., etc., are the best items to be doing these exercises with. For those of you that have not done that much painting with me, I would even go further to recommend and saying find some white objects rather than coloured things like apples and things like that. Even lighter coloured apples, pears, bananas, things that are lighter in tone and maybe don't have as many blemishes or as many changes like what this does, as beautiful as this apple is, that can be misleading and difficult to really get to grips with seeing the tones that form the modelling of the object that you're looking at. I'll be using my big palette, my big studio palette, and starting with some really big brushes. So I'll be starting with like a number 12, either a long flat or a filbert, but start with your biggest brushes that you've got. And then progressively, as the painting develops and that you need to be making marks that are smaller, then start to work with your smaller brushes. But work with the biggest brush for as long as you can. It keeps the painting painterly, and it stops you from getting too fiddly, which is really, really important. So I'll probably go from a 12 to a 6 and then maybe something smaller, but the majority of the painting you'll see will happen with that big number 12. Your process and how you approach this is that the first thing you want to get down is the chiaroscuro, that broad, light and dark pattern that you can see. So in the case of the apple here that I'm looking at, and I mean it'll be slightly different for you as it is for me because of our angle, but is that broadly speaking, the dark pattern is the dark here on the apple and its cast shadow out here. The rest, and of course there's a little bit of a dark down in there where it dips down in for the stalk there into the core. The rest of it I would be treating as a light, so that the chiaroscuro would be initially painted this in one tone, and then the light and the surrounds here in another tone, 2 tones, and that's all I want to establish first. And really be making sure that you're getting the shape of that dark correct in that massing. Spend your most amount of time in that stage. This is your stage where you're getting your placement in terms of where it fits here within this space. If you're finding that you're working and it's all over here, wipe it off or scrape it back as much as you can and reposition it. Don't just continue on just for the sake of continuing on. This is the important bit to be measuring. So you'll see me in the initial bits put down some marks indicating some points. Say for instance the distance between that and that, I'll put a mark and another mark, and I'll be measuring by my eye whether that corresponds to that which I can see there. So I'm going to be trying to paint this apple what you call sight size, that the painting and the object are of a similar scale. I'm not going to enlarge it, I'm not going to make it smaller. So, let's get to it. So, hopefully, from that quick little video of me demonstrating, you were able to see the approach and the appropriateness of looking for those parts that I described in that previous video. That I divided the apple into its light-dark pattern, the chiaroscuro, and then further looked to divide up those sections, the light side, the shadow, and the cast shadow, which then involves the background as well when you think about the cast shadow, into further light and dark versions of those initial chiaroscuro marks that I put down first. Also, that idea of working with big brushes to keep you loose and fresh to begin with, to make you painterly, and then progressively working towards smaller brushes as you get into working within some of those finer details, like when I put in the umbra here, or the highlight, the stalk, etc. But primarily most of that painting there was done with that number 12 and that number 6. So they were the main two brushes. Of course you can see, hopefully, humps, highlights, reflected light, the darks, halftones, the highlights, as I said, penumbras, umbras, etc. So all those parts that we talked about in terms of the sphere are visible here within the apple. The next part of this exercise now is to introduce a second and then a third object for the following two paintings. So the next painting would have 2 and the third painting 3 objects. When you're starting to deal with extra objects, some other things start to happen, which I'll explain to you now. So here's a close-up of the subject matter, roughly from the position that I saw it and how I painted it. And now I'll add in a second object. Now that I've added in a second object, the vase in this case, which is quite dark in tone, it started to affect how you perceive, and in some cases actually has changed, some of those parts like reflected lights, the tones of the darks and the humps. It's also changed our perception of what are the darker and the lighter parts. So when you're starting to develop that chiaroscuro to begin with, your middle tone that you work up may be now slightly different by adding in this darker tone. So don't just start with the same mix of greys that you've done from that previous painting. Adding in this new object changes where you need to begin with in the middle. The biggest areas that you can see now that are different is here in the dark of the apple here. This area here has now slightly lightened. That is now because there is some light reflecting off this vase, which is now closer to it than the surfaces around it, and so it's reflecting just that little bit more light into the darks and lightening up this area here. You can also too see by now adding in this vase that we've changed the shape of that initial chiaroscuro too. So here is that chiaroscuro that we would have begun in the single object, and its shadow would be here, but now the shadow of the apple is joining into the dark. So the shadow, or the cast shadow from the apple is casting onto the vase and darkening this area, and we're going up here and down, and then we've got the cast shadow of the vase out here. So our dark pattern has changed considerably. And finally, we've added in a third object. So this other apple over here. Now again, by adding in that third object, we're strengthening up and changing the chiaroscuro again. So this has remained much the same as what that last painting would be, but now we're adding in this dark over here. And this dark now on this apple helps define the edge and create a contrast there with this apple. So we've got this second one here. What you may also notice though is the strength of the dark up in this part of the apple as opposed to down here. It's hard to distinguish the terminator in this part here. And that's because the apple, the red apple, is now reflecting light into this yellow apple. And there's a slight redness now in the yellow apple through this section here. And that's the colour also. It's not just the light reflecting, it's the colour of the apple reflecting in. So this part here, there would be a terminator here, is being diminished because of reflected light. So this is when you start to introduce other objects. You need to be looking for the changes, the differences to what we've been looking at in that first single object. The terminator might be there, but it might be harder to see. The reflected lights will be stronger because of now there's more surfaces that light is reflecting off. And depending on the quality of the objects that you add in, so for instance, this vase here is quite shiny, so it will be reflecting a lot of colour around. Another thing, as I said here, was this area here is looking a bit dark, or considerably darker on this apple, is because this dark vase is reflecting dark colour into this part of the apple too. And you can probably see if I take that away, maybe the camera doesn't quite, but it's lightened ever so slightly as opposed to when I put it back in. Thank you very much for taking your time to watch this video, and in the next video I'll go through the process of painting the apple in colour.